borders. Once Putin controlled Crimea, new infrastructure connecting the Russian mainland to the peninsula was constructed to make moving goods. When he invaded Crimea, Putin may have been testing the waters to see how the world would react to him illegally annexing the part of his neighbor. And when there was no repercussion for his actions, he knew that his invasion of Ukraine would likely be met with similar indifference. For Russia, Crimea serves not only as a staging ground for soldiers, but a vital part of the supply chain that ensures troops currently holding the Donbass region of the country are properly equipped and fed. It's here that Russians from launching attacks further into Ukraine for the past several months, and where troops are currently dug in until reinforcements and equipment can be sent. What this means is that Crimea is a key strategic location for Russia's future plans in Ukraine. Without controlling Crimea, Russia will lose the ability to emergency move tanks and weapons to the front lines. Putin knows this, which is why even as Ukrainian forces launch missiles and bomb bridges in Crimea, Russia refuses to allow them to show weakness in the region. The moment Ukraine retakes Crimea, the war will be lost for Russia.
Get through to your garage,
Military and political consequence for Putin, which is why he's so desperate to hold on to the Crimean Peninsula. Along with being a resupply hub, Crimea acts as a missile launching ground for Russia. The missiles they deploy to the peninsula are relatively well protected at the moment, and can hit key targets in Ukraine. The air bases in Germany also allow Russian planes and drones to carry out bombing runs as far away as Kyiv. The only reason that Russia can constantly harass major Ukrainian cities is because of its occupation of Crimea. But the most important military aspect of Crimea for Russia comes from the port city of Sevastopol, where Russia's Black Sea Fleet resides. Russia's used this group of naval ships to blockade Ukraine, cutting off supplies.
I'll get back to it then.
It still reaches Ukraine through other means, but the control of the Black Sea, made possible by Russia controlling a major port in Crimea, has severely crippled the Ukrainian economy and its ability to bring supplies into the country. Sevastopol is one of Russia's only non-water ports, meaning it can be used year-round. This is important not only for its military, but for trade as well. Crimea is a prime location on the Black Sea to receive goods from North Africa and the Middle East, but also allows Russia to move cargo into and out of the Mediterranean. Without Crimea, Russia would not be able to maintain control over the Black Sea. Its naval ships have been used to bombard ports as well as coastal cities, and even though Ukraine has sunk the Russian flagship Moskva, they don't have the naval capability to break the blockades put in place. So Crimea is clearly important for the Russian military and economy. There's another more insane reason that Putin believes it was his right to seize the peninsula. Vladimir Putin has said
You're
bikers,
right? Because the buyer wants to put a bike into the back of a truck.
He's so
It's good to go when you are.
to Crimea in the first place. And incorporating the peninsula back into Russian borders, he was paying tribute to Catherine the Great and the Russian Empire of the late 1700s. Of course, Putin wanted Crimea for its strategic significance, but he also wanted to show the people of Russia and the rest of the world he was capable of expanding Russian borders to create his own Russian empire. The craziest part was that independent polls conducted in 2018 showed that 86% of Russians supported the forced annexation of Crimea. This was likely due to the brainwashing and misinformation campaigns carried out by state-controlled media, but the support for reincorporating Crimea back into Russia was staggering. For decades, Crimea was used as a playscape for the Russian elite, and even in recent times, it's become a popular tourist destination due to its beautiful coastlines and temperate climate. These factors definitely had less impact on Putin's decision to illegally annex the region, but you can't help but wonder if he had dreams of sitting at a resort in Crimea while brainstorming ways to take over the world. Putin will also do anything he can to reduce Western influence anywhere near Russian borders. Seizing Crimea meant the trade networks between Europe and Ukraine were severely disrupted. Just by incorporating the relatively small piece of land into Russia, Putin found a way to stop further encroachment by the West on what he saw to be his sphere of influence. Goods from Western countries coming into the region via Crimea were not something that Putin wanted, and by holding the territory, he ensured that Western influence was placated while growing his own influence in the region. Like with many parts of the world seized by powerful countries, Crimea holds vast amounts of resources that Russia needs. In particular, Crimea has a large source of natural gas and oil. Both of these things are necessary to keep the Russian economy going. But controlling the peninsula also serves another purpose. After Putin annexed Crimea, he could control where the oil and natural gas for the region was going. This meant that European nations that once received some of their energy resources from Ukraine, and Crimea in particular, would no longer have the option of buying these resources from Ukraine. It was Russia or nothing. Putin would literally do anything to disrupt Western society. After he gained control of Crimea, anyone who procured natural gas and oil from the region of the world, in effect, would be paying Russia. It also allowed Russia to control distribution, which severely hurt Ukraine's economy and caused them to lose access to an area that provided the nation with a large percentage of its energy. Ever since Putin seized Crimea, he effectively declared an economic war on Ukraine. It was terrible that he was allowed to get away with so much, as the Ukrainian people have been suffering at the hands of Putin for much longer than just the past year. It's clear why Russia wanted Crimea and why it's so important. But what would happen if Ukraine managed to retake the peninsula and push Russian forces out of the region? The initial benefits would be that if Ukraine could reclaim the Donbas region in Crimea, it would mean that they secured all the lands that Russia stole from them. Ukraine would also now control the resources, ports, and land that would provide the country with a much-needed economic boost. All the strategic benefits that Russia now enjoys because of Crimea would go to Ukraine. They would be able to use the ports, airstrips, and bridges into Russia for their own military objectives. If Ukraine reclaimed Crimea, it would pretty much mean that Russia had lost the war. But there's a much bigger problem for Russia and Putin if Ukraine takes back Crimea. Vladimir Putin used the annexation of Crimea as a way to prove to the Russian people that he could bring back the might of the Russian Empire. If he were to lose Crimea, he would throw everything he promised out the window. This would be something that not even the state-controlled media could spin into a positive. If Ukraine was able to secure Crimea, it would clearly show that Russia was not as strong as Vladimir Putin claimed it to be. The population is already hurting from the sanctions placed on the country, while all available resources are being poured into the war effort. So if the war ends up being a failure, the people of Russia will understandably become incredibly angry. There are already mass protests against the war breaking out across Russia. Huge numbers of talented workers, freethinkers, and people trying to avoid conscription are fleeing to neighboring countries. If Putin were to lose Crimea, it would be the end of his reign in Russia. The psychopathic dictator has surrounded himself with a series of protections that keep a coup from overthrowing his regime. But losing Crimea might be the one thing that could shatter Putin's coup-proof government. As Russia experiences defeat after defeat in Ukraine, Putin has continually blamed his generals and military advisors. Although he was warned before the initial invasion that Ukraine might be harder to defeat than anyone wanted to admit. But Putin, being Putin, decided to ignore the warnings and did whatever he wanted. Now the mad dictator of Russia is regretting those decisions. Putin and top officials in his government can continue to blame and replace the heads of military units because of their shortcomings, but if Russia loses Crimea, every military leader with power will look to blame the Kremlin for their failures. It's unlikely that the coup will come from within the military, but if soldiers and generals are pushed hard enough and everything they fought for begins to slip away, it could spell the end of the current Russian administration. Soldiers and their commanders will be disheartened and embarrassed. They would seek to blame someone, and then it would be extraordinarily clear who's at fault for this whole mess. Perhaps there would be an assassination attempt on Putin's life, or maybe generals in the battlefield would carry out secret meetings to find a way to overthrow the government. However, even though it's a remote possibility, the most likely scenario that could destroy Russia is Crimea.
I'm on the clock. What you want? Some wheels?
In the minds of the Russian people, Crimea belongs to them. And since Putin made the promise to bring Crimea and the rest of Ukraine back on Russian control, anything short of this would make the general public